Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to do a deep dive on Editas Medicine. They're a company using CRISPR technology to develop new medicines.
CRISPR, it really is a fascinating technology.
Yeah. And, if DNA is like the instruction manual for our bodies,
Right.
then CRISPR is kind of like a find and replace tool.
Right.
It allows scientists to go in and make very precise edits.
A fantastic analogy, and Editas is using that incredible technology to develop treatments for some really serious diseases.
And they're doing some really interesting things. Like they see CRISPR as a platform technology. They think it can target DNA in almost any cell or tissue,
That's right.
which, opens up a huge range of potential applications.
Yeah, a vast range.
And so they're developing treatments for everything from genetic diseases to even cancer.
Yeah.
And it seems like they're really trying to cover a lot of ground here. They're not just relying on the basic CRISPR toolkit, though.
Right.
They're also developing new tools and approaches. Like, for example, their sleek gene editing, which allows them to insert multiple therapeutic genes into cells.
That's right. That's really important for developing effective cell therapies.
Oh, absolutely.
Where you need to really enhance the disease-fighting power of the cells that you're using.
So you're thinking T cells, natural killer cells, stuff like that.
Exactly.
And that's really where this focus on optimizing CRISPR comes into play.
Right.
They're not just interested in making edits. They want to make those edits as efficiently and precisely as possible.
I think you're right. And a great example of that is their Editas technology,
Okay.
which allows them to measure on-target and off-target editing all at the same time. Being able to minimize those unintended consequences is a major concern with gene editing. Any gene editing.
Right. You don't want to, sniff out the wrong gene, right? You want to make sure that you're hitting the target.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like safety and precision are top priorities for them.
I think so.
But, how does all of this translate into an actual business? Like, how does Editas Medicine make money?
That's a great question. It's a question a lot of people have, especially with, biotech companies.
Right.
Many of these biotech companies rely heavily on collaborations and licensing agreements.
Yeah.
And Editas is no exception. One of their big partnerships is with Vertex Pharmaceuticals,
Okay.
where they've licensed their CS9 gene editing technology. So these types of collaborations bring in upfront payments, annual fees, and even milestone payments based on sales.
Oh, wow. So they're getting money from a lot of different sources.
That's right. That they've also engaged in what we call monetization financing.
Okay.
And so this involves selling future license fees for immediate cash, kind of a clever way to access capital without having to dilute the value of their shares.
I like that. Sounds like they're being strategic about how they leverage their IP to generate revenue and fuel their growth.
Yeah.
But it seems like they're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Right.
They're also, branching out into other areas like oncology and cell therapy development. And they're doing that through partnerships with companies like Bristol-Myers Squibb and Immatics. So it seems like they're trying to establish a strong foothold in a few key areas of medicine.
I would say that's accurate.
Yeah. To lead this ambitious charge, right?
Right.
They brought in Gilmore O'Neill as their CEO in 2022.
Yeah. He's a smart guy.
And he's got a lot of experience in genetic medicine and clinical development. Like, he's got a track record of actually bringing new treatments to market,
Right.
which is a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal.
So he's the guy behind medicines like Amondi's, Viati's 53, Spinraza, Plegridy, and Tecfidera. It's pretty impressive, right?
Yeah. That is an impressive resume.
Like, it sounds like he's the kind of person you want at the helm, right?
I agree.
To navigate this kind of, complex biotech world.
Definitely.
But what about the rest of the leadership team?
Well, they've got a great team, don't they?
Yeah, they seem to. Who else is kind of, steering the ship at Editas?
Well, they have Linnea Espesi. She's their chief people officer.
Okay.
Brings a lot of experience in human resources to the company.
Yeah.
And leading the scientific charge, of course, is Linda Berkeley,
Right.
their chief scientific officer. Over 35 years in biotechnology research.
Wow.
And played a key role in the development of several approved medicines.
So they've got a good mix of scientific business and operational expertise. Sounds great so far, right? But what about their financial health? How are they doing money-wise?
Right. Well, like many young biotech companies, the financials can be a little complex.
Yeah.
They haven't yet achieved consistent earnings
Okay.
and are currently operating at a net loss. And, they're not currently paying dividends.
That's pretty common for a company in this stage, though.
I think you're right. It's not unusual at all.
So not exactly a cash cow at the moment, but
Yeah.
they must be doing something right to keep the lights on, right?
Yeah.
and to attract investors. So what are we looking at? What are some of the good signs, the good indicators?
Well, one positive sign is their debt-to-equity ratio,
Okay.
which is relatively low. They're not super reliant on borrowed funds,
Yeah.
which gives them more flexibility.
Yeah, that makes sense. So they've got some breathing room.
Yeah, and they have a healthy cash runway,
Okay.
which should keep them going into the second quarter of 2027 based on their projections.
So at least they have some time, right, to kind of,
Right.
continue to develop and advance their clinical trials and stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
So give us some of the numbers. Like, what are some of the key financial metrics we should be paying attention to?
Well, their market cap is currently at $129.44 million. And they have a negative price-earnings ratio of negative 0.5x,
Okay.
which reflects that they're not profitable at the moment.
Yeah.
But, they're generating revenue. Their revenue for the past 12 months was $32.31 million.
All right. Not bad.
Yeah. And their diluted earnings per share for the same period came in at -$2.88.
So they are generating some revenue, but not enough yet to cover expenses
That's right.
and turn a profit.
Right.
What else are we looking at?
Well, they do have $269.91 million in cash on hand,
Okay.
with a total debt of $35.03 million.
Right.
Their total debt-to-equity ratio is 26.09%, which suggests their debt levels are manageable.
So that's good.
Yeah, I would say so. And their current ratio is a healthy 3.75,
Okay.
which indicates they have more than enough short-term assets to cover their liabilities.
Good.
But their quarterly free cash flow is negative $55.51 million. So that means they're burning through cash at a fairly rapid pace.
So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
I would say so.
Right. They've got some good things going, some things they need to work on.
Yeah.
So we'll kind of, dig deeper into what the market thinks about Editas' prospects after a quick break.
Okay.
But first, if you're interested in exploring some other gene editing companies, be sure to check out the stock suggestions in the comments below.
That's a great idea.
We compiled a list of companies that are making some really big advancements in this field. So we talked about Editas' business model, we talked about leadership, and we talked about their financial health.
Yeah.
But what does the market think about them? Like, are investors, bullish or bearish on Editas?
Well, it's a little bit of a mixed bag,
Yeah.
The stock has been pretty volatile the past few years. And analyst opinions, well, they're kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
Price targets, they range from $1 to $8. The average is somewhere around $3.82.
Wow. That is a huge spread.
Yeah, it is.
Like, why are some analysts so bullish and others so cautious?
Well, biotech is a very uncertain industry.
Right.
And when you add in cutting-edge technology like CRISPR,
Right.
there's huge potential upside, but there's also a lot of risk.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And Editas' recent shift towards in vivo gene editing, editing genes directly inside the body,
Yeah.
well, that's piqued a lot of interest.
Okay.
The stock has gone up about 38.6% since the beginning of the year, which has actually outperformed the S&P 500, which is down about 1.8%.
So it sounds like some investors are definitely, betting on this new direction.
Yeah, I think so.
That in vivo gene editing is going to be, a big deal.
Right.
But what about short sellers? Like, are there investors out there who are, skeptical about Editas?
Oh, yeah. There's definitely some skepticism out there.
Okay.
The short interest in Editas right now is sitting at 16.6%.
Oh, wow.
And the days to cover is 3.44 days.
Okay.
So that means there's a big chunk of investors who are betting against the stock.
Right.
But, if the price starts to rise, they're going to have to cover those positions pretty quickly.
So there's a little bit of a tug of war going on between the bulls and the bears.
Yes, so that's a good way to put it.
It'll be interesting to see who wins,
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about ownership structure. Who are the major players who own Editas stock?
Well, most of it really, is held by institutional investors. Like mutual funds, hedge funds, pension funds. That's pretty typical for a biotech company.
Yeah.
Especially one that's publicly traded.
Yeah, makes sense. So these big institutions are keeping a close eye on Editas.
Yes.
And they're probably influencing the stock price.
I think that's fair to say.
So what about insider ownership? Like, are the, executives and board members putting your own money into the company?
Well, it's relatively low.
Okay.
And that's something that can sometimes worry investors.
Yeah.
Because it could suggest a lack of confidence.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But, there could be lots of reasons for low insider ownership.
Okay.
It's not always a bad sign.
It's not always a reliable predictor of future performance.
That's right.
So it's important to look at the bigger picture.
I agree.
And speaking of the bigger picture, let's do a quick SWOT analysis. So we can really understand, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats for Editas. So starting with their strengths, what are they doing well?
Well, first off, they've got really deep expertise in CRISPR.
Okay.
And they've built a really strong intellectual property portfolio around that. I mean, that's a critical asset in gene editing. It's so competitive.
Absolutely.
And they've been smart about their partnerships, too. I mean, they've got a lot of collaborations with other companies and institutions.
Right.
And that gives them access to even more resources and expertise.
That makes a lot of sense. Collaborations are super valuable in a field as complex as gene editing.
Yeah, I think so.
So what else are they doing well?
I think their focus on rare genetic diseases is also a strength.
Okay. How so?
Well, it allows them to target, areas of high unmet medical need.
Yeah.
And potentially, if they're successful, they can get really high prices for their treatments.
Makes sense. So it's a good business strategy.
Yeah, and it also helps them differentiate themselves from competitors who are, going after those bigger markets.
So they're kind of carving out their own little niche.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Now, what about their stage of development?
Hmm.
Are they still in the early stages of research, or have they made some progress with, getting their therapies into trials?
No, I think they're pretty advanced.
Okay.
I mean, they've got several programs in clinical trials already, and that puts them way ahead of a lot of other companies who are, still stuck in the preclinical phase.
Right.
Plus, they're closer to actually making money from their treatments.
Yeah, that's a good point. So they're not just a research company. They're
Right.
actually, making progress towards selling therapies.
Yeah.
That's great. Now, what about their partnerships with Bristol-Myers Squibb and Ematics? How do those fit into their strengths?
Well, those are huge for their cell therapy work.
Yeah.
Those partnerships give them access to expertise, resources, maybe even manufacturing help.
Mhm.
And that stuff is essential for bringing these complex cell therapies to market.
It sounds like they have a lot going for them.
They really do.
But, every company has its weaknesses.
Yeah, of course.
So where do they need to improve? Where are they facing, some challenges?
Well, their history of net losses is a little bit of a concern. I mean, they haven't been able to create a steady revenue stream yet.
Yeah.
And they rely so heavily on collaborations.
Right.
And that makes them vulnerable to, changes in the biotech market.
That makes sense.
It puts a lot of pressure on them to, deliver in their clinical trials.
Right. So they're in a bit of a tricky financial position.
Yeah.
Okay. What else? What other weaknesses should we be thinking about?
Well, the competition is really intense.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, there are so many gene editing companies out there.
Right.
And it's a fast-moving field. They could easily get overtaken by somebody with better technology or a more successful trial.
So it's always a risk in, a new and cutting-edge field.
Yeah, for sure.
What about regulations? Is that a potential weakness too?
Yeah, I mean, the regulations are always uncertain in this kind of field.
Right.
Gene editing is still pretty new.
Yeah.
And regulators are still, figuring things out.
Yeah. They're learning as they go, right?
That's right. And there's always a chance they could make a decision
Right.
that really slows down Editas's progress.
So they're operating in a very, tightly regulated space.
Yeah.
And any setbacks from regulators could have a big impact on them.
That's right. And what about the technology itself? Are there any weaknesses with CRISPR?
Okay, yeah. That's a good point. I mean, I know one concern is the possibility of off-target edits, right?
Right.
Where the CRISPR system accidentally edits the wrong genes.
Yeah. And that can lead to really bad, harmful side effects.
So it's not perfect.
It's not perfect.
But Editas is working on that, right? Trying to,
Yeah.
improve the accuracy and the targeting.
Yeah. That's one of their main priorities.
Okay, so that's something that investors should be aware of.
Yeah, I think so.
So let's move on to opportunities. What are some of the, potential growth areas or positive trends that could really benefit Editas?
Well, the gene editing market is just booming right now.
Okay.
I mean, the potential uses for CRISPR are huge.
Right.
And the market is predicted to be worth billions and billions of dollars.
It sounds like a great market to be in.
It is. I mean, it's a huge opportunity for a company like Editas.
They're well positioned. Right?
Yes, very well positioned.
So what else? What other opportunities are there?
Well, CRISPR has the potential to totally revolutionize medicine.
I mean, it sounds like it, yeah.
We're just beginning to understand what it can do.
Yeah.
There are so many genomic medicines in development right now.
Wow.
I mean, it could change how we treat all kinds of diseases.
It's pretty exciting to think about.
It is.
Now, are there any opportunities that are really specific to Editas that you'd like to highlight?
Well, I think their development of new gene editing technologies is a huge opportunity. I mean, they're not just sitting around, waiting. They're actively researching other approaches to gene editing.
So they're staying ahead of the curve.
Yeah. I mean, these new approaches might be even more powerful.
Okay.
They might have different uses.
And that's really smart, to invest in that research and development to kind of stay on the cutting edge.
Yes, absolutely.
What about strategic acquisitions? Could that be another way for them to grow?
Yeah, that's a good point. They could acquire other companies.
Right.
And that would let them expand their, portfolio of therapies.
Right.
Or maybe get access to new technologies or, even move into different markets.
So lots of different options there.
Yeah.
Okay. So they have a lot of potential opportunities.
They do.
But every company also faces threats. So what are some of the challenges that could hold Editas back?
Well, one of the biggest ones is that other companies are making progress, too.
Right. It's competitive.
Yeah. I mean, someone else can come up with, a better gene editing tool or a more efficient way to deliver it or a better way to target genes.
And that would be bad news for Editas.
Yeah, it would. And then there's always the chance that their clinical trials could fail.
Yeah. That's always a risk in biotech.
It is. And a failed trial can really damage a company.
Right.
It can scare off investors and set them back years.
So that's definitely something to keep in mind.
Right. And remember, we talked about regulations as a weakness.
Yeah.
Well, they could also be a threat.
Okay. How so?
Well, regulators could make a decision that really hurts Editas.
Okay.
Like they could delay or reject their applications for trials or for marketing approval.
Right.
Or they could make them, do a lot of post-market surveillance.
Yeah.
And that stuff can make it hard to actually sell the therapies.
So it's a big hurdle for them to overcome.
Yeah, a big one.
And what about, public perception? Could that be a threat?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, people are sometimes, uncomfortable with gene editing.
Right.
They worry about ethical problems,
Yeah.
There could be protests.
Yeah.
People might even want to ban it altogether.
Right.
And that would make it really hard for Editas to operate.
Yeah. And that could, slow down the adoption of their therapies.
Exactly.
So managing public perception is going to be really important for them.
It is. It really is.
So we've talked about the technology, we've talked about the business, we've talked about, the regulations and public perception. What about intellectual property? Could that be a threat?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
There are a lot of intellectual property disputes in gene editing.
Right.
Companies are always fighting over patents.
Right.
Who invented what.
Yeah.
And if Editas gets caught up in a legal battle,
Right.
well, that could be expensive and it could take a lot of time.
And slow them down.
Yeah, exactly.
It sounds like it's a really complex landscape for Editas.
Yeah, no doubt.
They have a lot of potential, but they're also facing some serious challenges.
Yeah.
We'll finish up our deep dive with some final thoughts and a question for you to think about after a quick break.
Okay.
But first, if you want to learn more about Editas or other gene editing companies, make sure you subscribe to the Stock Analytics AI YouTube channel.
Yeah, that's a great resource.
We've got videos that break down all this complex stuff.
Yeah. And you can learn about other companies in the field.
And how to make better investment decisions.
Exactly.
All right, so we've looked at Editas Medicine from a bunch of different angles. Their business model, their leadership, their financial health, what the market thinks about them, who owns their stock, and even a SWOT analysis. That's a lot. So before we wrap things up, what are your big takeaways? What are the most important insights from our, deep dive?
I think what's really interesting is how ambitious Editas is. They're not just trying to develop, a couple of specific treatments. They want to build a platform that could change how we treat a whole range of diseases. And their focus on optimizing CRISPR, all their partnerships, I mean, it shows they're serious about, making this happen.
I agree. And Gilmore O'Neill's experience in bringing new medicines to market, I mean, that's huge. It's one thing to have, amazing technology, but getting those treatments to actual patients, that's a whole other challenge.
Oh, absolutely. And we can't forget about, the financial side of things. They're still losing money, and they're really dependent on those collaborations for revenue. That makes them, a little bit vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
They need to show a clear path to profitability if they want to really impress the market.
Yeah, for sure. And the competition is tough. Other companies are also doing cool stuff with gene editing. Someone could come out of nowhere with a better technology or a more successful trial, and that would be a problem.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And, we also have to think about the ethical side of gene editing. It's powerful technology. As it becomes more, powerful and easier to use, we need to talk about what it means for society and make sure it's used responsibly.
Right, it's not just about the science, it's about the bigger picture. One thing that really struck me was their focus on rare genetic diseases. It just makes sense, from a business perspective and a human perspective. These diseases don't have a lot of treatment options, so a successful CRISPR therapy could be life-changing for patients.
That's a really great point. It shows how gene editing could help us tackle some of the toughest diseases we face. And thinking bigger, it raises a question, What role will gene editing play in the future of healthcare? Will it lead to cures for diseases we thought were incurable? Or will it create a bunch of unintended consequences?
Those are some big questions we need to figure out as this technology keeps developing. But for now, that's the end of our deep dive into Editas Medicine. We hope you learned something and that you have a better understanding of this company and, what gene editing can do.
And if you want to learn more about Editas or other gene editing companies, check out the links in the episode description. We've got research reports, financial data, all that stuff.
And if you're serious about biotech investing, subscribe to the Stock Analytics AI YouTube channel. We've got tons of videos that break down complex financial info, give you insights on new trends, and help you make smarter investment decisions.
As always, remember that investing in the stock market is risky. This deep dive is just for information, not financial advice. Do your own research, talk to a financial advisor, and don't invest more than you can afford to lose.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Editas Medicine. It's been a really interesting journey. We'll be back with more deep dives into fascinating companies and game-changing technologies. See you next time.